Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Today's webinar is a bit of leftovers from a previous webinar talking about Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment, but also introducing some topics from friend and colleague Jeff Hunter, who's got the last part of the webinar to share. So I'm going to get this started and we'll be able to get to the material and then on to Jeff's material. So it's a little bit of housekeeping. I've got the phones on mute except for myself and Jeff, and we will unmute during Q&A time. If you want to put a question out there, you can type it in on the chat function and we can refer to it that way. This webinar is being recorded for your use later on and also to share with others who weren't able to participate. So a bit of refresher slides. I introduced this when I did part one of the webinar, something I learned from Derek and Laura Cabrera, a great book called Systems Thinking Made Simple, and the realization that we don't really interact with the world, even interacting with each other. We view things through our mental models, and our mental models are merely an approximation about the way the world works. And when we have experiences the world gives us feedback and we can choose to modify our mental models. And I say this because what I've tried to do in this webinar is to just talk about some of the mental models around the topic of strategy deployment. So if you were able to participate at an earlier webinar, we went through the topics that are listed there on the left-hand side. And I have a link to that webinar that we did last time if you weren't able to participate. Before we get into items 7 through 10, I just got a bit of a recap on the 2 with the asterisks. So I want to explain a little bit about that. Last time we talked about the problem is not the hierarchy. And here's what we were talking about. So this hierarchy model that if you ask most people where they work in an organization or tell us about your organization, they would show a picture of an org chart. And that's common and it serves a purpose. When we study this, and particularly study the work by Adrian Bijan, a professor of thermodynamics, and he identified what he realized is a new law of physics. He calls it the Constructal Law of Physics. And he found similarities with this structure, which essentially helps to transfer energy, few going to many. And you see it in different areas in nature. You can see a river delta there, the lungs, the tree, both the top and bottom of the tree. And so that structure serves a purpose, and it has its basis in physics that I didn't know about, but I've learned about it. And he called it the Constructal Law of Physics. And you can see the notation there about the book that I would recommend to learn more about this. Anyway, when it comes to organizations, one of the functions that this view typically describes is the command and control nature of the prevailing style of management. And the structure is not the problem, it's how we view it. And if we turn it sideways and think about how this structure can move from being about command and control to alignment and coaching, then we can think about the different roles in the organization and how people are trying to provide value ultimately to the customer on the right-hand side. So last time I talked about when we think of this view of the organization, you can think about major systems, one of which would be around focusing on the strategic, preparing the organization for future, developing strategies, answering these questions that you see here, and then also deploying strategy. So we think about a system this way where people in leadership position in the ideal world would be spending a big part of their time in that world answering those questions. The managers, some role and responsibility, even the front line, of course, would have a role and responsibility, but not to the same level. What about the other part of the time? Well, I've had some people call it operations. We talk about how are you providing value to the customers on a daily basis. And so you can talk about a daily management system. And we use the dimensions of align, enable, and improve around that. And a third type of call it a system or an attribute that's important that weaves the two together, is standard work. Standard work for leaders, standard work for managers, standard work for frontline. And we talked about where most organizations are currently. It's not so evenly distributed as we would like to see. Again, the line for many of the organizations is people are doing some strategy planning, but many times you find leaders and managers spending a lot of their time in the daily management, solving the problems of the day. And that seems to be the current state. Some organizations are farther along than others. And so a lot of the work will be trying to bridge the gap, which means there's new rules to follow, principles, and new roles, and understanding what those roles are. And some of the kinds of roles that you would see where the front line would be doing specific things, where the managers would be doing specific things, and where the leaders would be doing specific things, those are some examples of the kinds of roles. And just the observation, again, this is from last time. This is going to take some time. So this is a refresher of some items from last time. So what's different? Why am I bringing this up again? Well, I noticed that it would be beneficial to flip the two triangles and look at it this way. Now, why is that the case? Well, when we think about people trying to make improvement in organizations, many times they're using improvement events, rapid improvement events, Kaizen events, and they have a process that's producing some stable output. They want to make improvement, so they'll see it jump to an improvement level, and then they'll have another rapid improvement event after it stabilizes, and then you see it carrying on in the future. What we've noticed, and perhaps you've noticed too, is the process improvement doesn't always stay in place. As a matter of fact, it degrades. Another law of physics comes along, entropy, and it will go back to its previous state. And that's why it makes sense to think about where does a daily management system fit in. So one reason I shifted this was so you could see that wedge would be inserted there to maintain the gains that you would achieve during the improvement events and not have them dissipate. A lot of this is discussed in the most recent white paper that we've published, and you can see the URL there that you can get on the bit.ly link, side-by-side management. So that's a refresher on some topics from previous time. One topic we didn't get to last time is thinking about big and small PDSA cycles using the principle of embracing scientific thinking. Now, we've seen this model around a lot. It is deceptively simple. It can take you years to really understand, to fully understand what this model means, and years of practice. Dr. W. Edwards Deming, who helped teach the Japanese and other countries and other companies years ago, saw this as not just a cycle for improvement, but a cycle for learning. And he, when he did his work, insisted on the use of the word study versus check. Now, that's a topic for future conversation. I personally was involved in conversations where he would clarify that with people and make sure that they understood that the word that he wanted to be used was study. But regardless, one of the things to think about with this way of thinking and improving and learning is there's an important part where you're trying to grasp the situation. What do we understand is currently going on? And so we see it inserted into the model. A handy place to put it is right in the middle, because you're trying to grasp the situation at all parts of the PDSA cycle. Now, how I've seen it and we've seen it applied in a strategy deployment sense is using it this way. So when you think about you've grasped the situation for the organization, develop the plan, answer those questions that you see there. Where are we going? How do we get there? What's preventing us? And I'm pretty sure Jeff's going to have some topics related to this in his part of the presentation. Plans developed, then you deploy the plan and understand a process of catch-ball that I've got a little bit to talk about. And I'm sure many people on the call today have experience in the catch-ball process. And also, what are the lead roles? Who are the lead roles that are the key proponents of the parts of the plan? Then we step back and study after we've given it time to deploy. There has to be some regular study and adjust time. And going back to standard work, this needs to become a function of a routine where leaders devote the time, spend the time to study and adjust multiple times during the course of a year, not just at the end of the year as to how did that work. And then to improve, some reflection and learning, cataloging the knowledge. What did the organization learn? Again, it's a cycle for learning and for improvement. So what might this look like? It looks, you see examples in many organizations. And in a general sense, here's some observations that I've noticed. First of all, a system develops over time and it starts simple. I've got a follow-up slide on this notion a little bit. So here's a timeline. It shows a future fiscal year and then maybe the current year. So suppose it's May and you're thinking about we need to be doing some planning for the next fiscal year. So there's a good chunk of time that's devoted to developing the plan. That's a strategy development process. And where you see the different roles are, you'll see the leaders are taking the role here to determine, again, grasping the situation, where are we at? And they're answering those questions. What do we need to do? Why do we need to do it? How are we going to do it? Who's going to do it? When are we going to do it? Questions like that. And they should, and you often see them, have a catch-ball process with the next level in the organization, answering those questions. And in a good catch-ball process, the managers will feed that information back to the leaders, talking about the implications for their areas. If they're going to go in a certain direction, what do they need to be doing and adjusting? And leaders need to know that. And this cycle can go several times, of course. Same thing with the managers. They would be having a catch-ball session and process to talk about the implications for our area. What does that mean for the front line? What things are going to be different? Explaining not only the what, but the why. Again, the catch-ball process continues. Now, this is a high-level description of what we've seen. And what I've noticed is there's a point in time where they say, okay, the year has started. We're now going to deploy. We're going to do. And this is where you see a study and adjust time inserted for the leaders. And then a study and adjust time is devoted for the managers. And also some study and adjust for the front line. Again, it does not start off this complex. This is what you would see in a more mature organization that has been doing this for a while. But in a general sense, what you notice is the PDSA cycle at a high level, working with smaller cycles of PDSA over time to understand how is that plan being deployed? Are we getting closer? What adjustments need to be made and at what part of the organization? And then finally, you would see that planning needs to begin for the next year. And perhaps we're getting better at that, and the amount of time that's devoted for future planning for the next fiscal year is not as long as it was in the past. And again, anyway, this is what we've noticed as far as a high-level application of PDSA cycle. I mentioned systems evolving, and they start simple and they get to complex. And here's what we've noticed. When people begin to act on the principles and they're trying to, say, develop a strategy deployment system, you're going to see some experimentation, and it's going to look like some experimentation with tools. Let's try some different huddles. Let's use some different boards. Let's perhaps get into experiments with going on Gemba walks and seeing what's going on. Over time, you'll see that those tools will start to coalesce and form into systems. And you'll say, we see some initial integration where the tools are starting to form together to form simple systems. And then, let's say at a department level, you would see how the different systems are starting to become more formalized, where, for instance, you see strategy deployment connected to communication, connected to idea sharing, connected to problem solving, connected to standard work systems. And then ultimately you would see an organizational expansion as it moves beyond the individual departments across an organization. Now, our observation is if you try to start at that organizational expansion level and develop a sophisticated, complex strategy deployment system at the get-go, it's not likely to take hold because it hasn't had time to grow. It's much more like organic process, like gardening, as opposed to building a machine which is mechanistic. So here's an example of how this may look like in an organization. Comes from our friends at Winneshiek Medical Center. They've got an organizational purpose. They describe it as being the most trusted partner in healthcare, and they're trying to align that with the work systems throughout the organization, say at a department level. So you would see at an organization level a strategy deployment system start to evolve. It may include some whiteboards and huddles, different sort of tools coming together. What does this look like at the department level? Here's an example from the rehab department where they would have their version of the strategy that is a mirror image. What does it mean for rehab if the organization is moving in that direction? So they're going to have dashboards. They're going to have huddles. It's going to be for communication. It's going to include some recognition. They're going to start and continue with idea sharing. Again, reflecting back on what is it that we do in our organization, in our part of the organization that's trying to achieve the purpose of the overall organization, including those of strategically important changes, not just the daily work system, but to move us into the future. Idea sharing tends to evolve into problem solving, getting to root causes, which then evolves into creating standard work, and then the cycle continues. One recent addition, this group has noticed that as you standardize, you need to think about what's our training system, which gets back into the enabling part of the model. So it's just a high-level example about how do we see this evolving in organizations that really make this work. Here's another observation. It's, I call it, it's not about the tool. One thing I've noticed is there seem to be sort of two camps when it comes to strategy deployment. One seems to be about we need to use an X matrix, and here's how you use the X matrix. There's another camp that says, no, we don't use X matrices. We use A3s. We use a series of A3s, and that's how we do it. Some things that I've been thinking about, it's not about the tool, it's about what behavior does the tool drive, and how does the tool help to drive the behavior that you want. I've had some people say, you know, this X matrix is really a form of an A3, so we're really not talking about something that different. And then also, does the tool support the system to achieve its purpose? So this is an observation again, and this is a presentation on Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment. So if you find yourself in conversations about which tool should we use, it might be beneficial to back up and say, so what does the tool do? What behavior do we want to see from the system, and how do we drive the kind of behavior that we want to see? Here's another observation, and the final one from my list, but it's something that we've actually written a white paper on this, and I'll talk about a little bit later. True north is more than measures. So this is a high-level review of some of the things we talk about in our sustainability model of our transformation model. Organizations want to achieve results, and that includes organizations that have a strategy deployment plan. They're hoping to achieve certain results. They can be in quality, safety, cost, delivery, engagement, satisfaction, any number of categories. Everyone wants to get these results. They can call these KPIs, key performance indicators. And again, we see organizations that they learn that they can get better results through the use of tools, and they're happy about that, and they're going to try to push those tools into their existing systems. But we've noticed that the systems, because there's people in the existing systems, have a tendency to push back. And for many organizations, this is the extent of their journey. It's a series of these efforts, and it becomes the flavor of the month. We call it the comfort of the comfort zone. Some organizations understand that there's more to learn and apply, and they understand the power of purpose. They'll turn their attention then to understanding the new principles of management that are needed, and to use those, their understanding of those, to design the kind of systems that they want to see. As they study principles, and the leaders play a key role here, they'll start to identify what are the key behavior indicators, the KBIs, that they need to model and lead. They'll also understand and appreciate the key role that managers play in the systems that they have in an organization. And the front line, their key role needs to be around owning and managing and improving their tools that they use in their part of the system. Again, that's a high-level overview of some of the things we introduce in our model. We have talked about what we call the see, do, get relationship, and it gets into this notion of true north is more than measures. When organizations understand the power of purpose and they have a clear idea what they want to see, and this includes what do we want to see for our vision, for our strategy, what are we going to do, gets into ideal behaviors, that then leads to what they're going to get. And ideal behaviors are, you can think of them as a leading indicator for what is a lagging indicator, which is KPIs. And we see this whole box here as what we call true north. So the message here is when people talk about you need to think about true north, that's true. We encourage them to think beyond merely measures. It has to be about the relationship between what do you want to see, what are you going to do, and what are you going to get. So both KBIs and KPIs. A recent white paper that we wrote on this, you can find at that bit.ly link on the bottom. We think we're not too off track here with this. We see this reflected in some of the knowledge and advice going over the years. This is something from TSSC, subsidiary of Toyota Motor Manufacturing. And you see this similarly, and it's reflected in our white paper. Again, here's some reminders. I mentioned this last time. So we talk about what is strategy deployment. It's also important to think about, well, what is it and what isn't it? It's not management by objective as commonly practiced by people. Peter Drucker was one of the founders of strategy deployment and had good intentions. And it became off the wheels later on as Dr. Deming observed here. Here's a quote from Dr. Deming, how MBO was misunderstood. And essentially it became people being focused on primarily those numbers and getting the numbers at any cost. It's not management by results. Again, a quote from Dr. Deming, trying to take immediate action on all of the things that you see every day. And it's also not management by imposition of results, trying to impose improvement or action on a system that isn't capable of it. So it isn't those three things. And it's also not what I would call management by spreadsheet, scorecard, and other forms of trickery. If you find yourself merely looking at Christmas-colored spreadsheets such as this, and people will look at this and they'll say, we're doing strategy deployment, you have to ask yourself a question. What is the behavior that that tool is driving, that that system is driving? And is it really about strategy deployment, or have you found yourself focusing primarily on the numbers and not the systems? So this is a summary of the topics that I've covered, first of all, a couple months ago, and then today. We're going to unmute the phones later on when we get into the topics that I delivered. And what I'd like to do now is turn the topic over to Jeff Hunter. And he's got some additional topics and thoughts on this presentation on strategy deployment. So Jeff, as you can see, here's his credentials on the slide. I first met Jeff several years ago. He was working at ThetaCare and very knowledgeable. And I was very pleased that he said yes to providing a bit of time today to provide some information about what he's seen and observed related to this important topic. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks to everybody on the phone for inviting me to do this and inviting me into the consortium. The reason that I want to stay involved and on the journey is I feel like I'm working my way out of purgatory. When we first started doing lean thinking at ThetaCare, I thought it was, I was fully supportive, but I thought that it was for operations only. I didn't think it had anything to do with my job. And so it was after about 3 years when John Toussaint asked me if I would help him apply this thinking to how the senior leadership team creates value, that I got going on the journey. And so I felt like I was late to the game. I wish I had known this 40 years ago so that I would have been better at developing people to improve process to serve purpose. But I got started when I did. I am really interested in this. I learn a lot from you in this consortium on the phone, and I'm glad to be part of it. So I'm just sharing some insights that I've gathered so far. I do have a point of, so let's see, Mike, I'm going to have to grab, there we go. There we go. And so I do have a point of view that, and I know this is going to sound simple, that we've got to have a system of managing strategy if we're going to win with customers against competitors. And as simple as that sounds, I haven't seen us with a system of making choices or making choices that are creating differentiation, and strategy is about creating differentiation. So if this is, kind of the background and current condition, I think we have historically in healthcare been treating strategy as asset acquisition, not achieving differentiation through process improvement. And I think our view of strategic planning has been as an event, not as a capability of the leadership team. So that practice has gotten us, I think, into the current situation where we're not making strategic choices and we're creating overburden. And the lack of putting strategy back into strategy deployment, I've had a few people say, I think we're doing strategy deployment, but I don't really see us deploying strategy. It's that lack of differentiation. And Michael Porter would have, plenty of examples of markets where everybody got better, but nobody got different. And so it created a commodity market. The third one, the lack of rapid cycle learning, is creating inertia in the organization. And the lack of effective catchball is creating confusion. And about half of my work is in healthcare, and about half of it is in other industries, from manufacturing to higher education to many different industries. And I see these issues more often in healthcare than I see, for example, in manufacturing concerns. Now, some of the reasons that I think we've gotten here is that the nature of the healthcare industry didn't require differentiation and necessarily operational effectiveness that, until, let's just say, the last, couple of decades. I mean, it's been up until the last really 5 years that we have had market demand and price increase year after year. And so when there's plenty of money to go around, imitating your competitors isn't a problem. But when the gravy train stops, and it has been stopping for a few years now, where demand is flat to declining for particularly hospital services, the price, I know at ThetaCare for 3 years running, our realized price after discounts and all was flat for 3 years running. That creates a different environment. Second point, the nature of healthcare organizations. I mean, there is a class of organizations in the literature called professional bureaucracies, and healthcare organizations and universities are really good examples of them, where professional autonomy is critical. And the relationship between the customer and the professional often trumps the relationship between the professional and the organization. So it's just, and in healthcare, we're paid to think that way because we get paid to stay within those silos in many organizations. So the industry, the nature of the industry didn't require it. The nature of the organization made it very difficult. So I believe in the last point that as we translated the term Hoshin Connery first into policy deployment, which never really worked in English, And so then we translated it in the strategy deployment that we've lost the concept of strategy. So to get out of this situation, again, I think we'd require a system that's going to facilitate choice making and accelerates the learning process. That system has got to be based on this idea of strategy. And so again, a short, paragraph here, but it's got a lot in it. Strategy is about differentiation, and it means choosing a different set of activities to deliver a unique mix of value. So an example that I use of that is, I guess it was about 20 years ago, we were very successful in our market of how we managed our health plan and health plan relationships to swing a whole bunch of market share from a system over to our system. Well, those customers came over expecting urgent care centers because that's what they had experienced in the other system. That's how they got their urgent needs met. So I didn't know any better. I went to our physicians and said, will you help us set up urgent care centers? And they pretty much threw me out saying, that's not our business model. We develop deeper, longer relationships with patients. And so here's what we'll do to meet this demand for patients under urgent circumstances. We will reconfigure how we see new patients in our practice to increase access for new and existing patients to meet them under urgent circumstances. And that process improvement, that different way of meeting the need, one in the marketplace, is a different set of activities that delivered a unique mix of value and created differentiation. So this system that I talk about starts on the upper right, and it builds right on, what I have learned from you that Mike articulated earlier. Start with understanding the situation, defining the strategic issue. So that, that's the market position assessment and what's the problem that we have to solve and to what degree is innovation going to be required to solve it. And then making choices of how to solve it today and not being, what can we defer? So what do we need to work on now and what can we defer? Now, when we get away from thinking that strategic planning is an event every 3 to 5 years, when we thought that way, everybody had to get their ideas on the table, because if they weren't there, then they were going to get lost for 3 to 5 years. So the only way that we could deal with all of those ideas was to create, my job was supposedly to create big labels and categories of activities that could describe anything we thought we might have to do in the next 3 to 5 years. And that didn't solve anything. All we did was overburden the organization. When we start thinking of this as a leadership capability, what we're asking ourselves is, with our vision in mind, what should we be working on now to get ourselves from our current state to the next target state? When we get there, let's stabilize and standardize where we got to, and then ask ourselves, look again, where is that vision? And then what is the next target state we need to get to? And how do we get to that vision? So these are our choices of, in real time, of what do we need to be working on to advance the organization and what can we defer? Now, knowing that when we make this choice that says, here's what we're going to do, we can't predetermine the future. So we're developing a hypothesis of how we think we're going to be able to solve that problem. So with that hypothesis, we have to ask ourselves the question, what must be true? What are the most critical assumptions behind that hypothesis where we really don't know the answer? And now I'm just going to be borrowing from pure, lean startup or design thinking. Let's start answering those questions by using a minimum viable product and using lean learning loops to build out the solution to that problem. Since we're introducing new work in the organization, we do have to align and focus with the catch-ball process. But then we need a visual management system, because as soon as we define, here's what we're going to do, what we think is going to solve the strategic issue, we know that tomorrow something else is going to fall from the sky that could compete with priority. So how do we manage those new ideas and make sure that we're focused on the critical few things today and continue to select and deselect what has to be done? So with that, in order to make choices, I've found, what am I learning, I guess, if through my experience in what happens and what works. I found that using Lafley and Martin's integrated cascade of choices to define a hypothesis. So when we say this is what we should do, this is our strategy, we should be asking ourselves this, integrated cascade of questions. What would great look like, and how would we know? That's the winning aspiration. Where are we going to play, and specifically, where do we need to win? I mean, in healthcare, this is what I've learned now. I just call it, where will we win? Because everybody has to talk about all the things they have to do to just play to play. And I get that. I get we're large and complex, and there's many things that we have to do to play to play. The question is, what are we going to do uniquely where we're going to win? And what are those spaces, those segments that could be demographic or geographic, or those products and services? Where is it that we're going to choose now to win? And how will we win is the source of competitive advantage. So the combination of where we're going to play and how we're going to win is very externally facing. We're looking at, if you will, customer segments in which we're going to create a unique value that they must recognize, or we're not going to do any good. So with that part of the hypothesis, then we ask ourselves, what are the capabilities and management systems internally required to create that competitive advantage in that segment that we have chosen to play? And if we do this, we're going to hit our winning aspiration. Now, again, understanding that that is a hypothesis that we've generated, we've got to be able to test that hypothesis using lean learning loops. So it's the guess, test, learn. Again, I have learned a lot from Matthew May. He has facilitated sessions with us at ThetaCare, taught me this method. I've been applying this method and finding, I've got many, many examples of where building out the solution using lean startup thinking or design thinking makes us much more rapid in our response. So that gets us, through the intent part. Now, I borrow this from our friends here at IEX, the 2 ways to deploy strategy. What I'm finding is that a lot of us have some very, really well thought out visual systems of technically managing the catch ball in the organization, if you will. How we cascade whatever tools, if it's an X matrix or A3s, that we, and when are we going to meet and talk about this? Kind of that technical side of catchball, I've seen some really good examples of. But in healthcare, what I'm finding is that we struggle with the human side of catchball, with the nature of the discussions that we are having as we are deploying this strategy. How do we, accept strategic intent, communicate it to our direct reports? How do we influence strategy in the other direction? These discussions, I find, are done better in many other industries. I find we haven't been trained that well or make time to do them that well. And
Jeff, I think your phone's cutting out a bit.
slide to advance. I don't, let me try one more time with this and see if that.
Your phone was cutting
works
out for a bit.
There we go. Okay. So managing choices, the visual way to see on the right-hand side, what is the work in progress? An X matrix might help, again, the A3s might help, but a visual way to see the work in progress. But before things jump right into progress, being able to, manage that work. So it starts with the idea board, if you will. Where do we start here? Let's collect all those great ideas that we've got. With the evaluation process, let's understand which ones might have more potential than others. And then on the weight work, use of the weight work board to have those good ideas that we want to put into progress next, but we have to wait for capacity. So a very visual system of seeing the ideas, running them through the evaluation process, choosing the best, using the pick chart, on the weight workboard, and then when we have capacity, moving them into progress. And if we are able to manage the ideas that way and accelerate the learning, then we're going to get more things through the pipeline, and we're going to be able to act a lot faster. At any given time, a leadership team has to manage buckets of work to get to true north. On the right-hand side, I mean, we have all these, and I've never seen as many as I've seen in healthcare, all these big rocks thrown at us like ICD-10 and electronic health record conversions, huge projects that consume cross-organizational resources, but they're not going to create differentiation. I put building buildings into that category because anybody can imitate a building, or just simply buying the technology, anybody can do that. So we spend a lot of our time managing the big rocks. In the middle, operational effectiveness, just coming to work every day and getting better at the process of how we do our work every day. We don't leave a lot of work for strategy deployment, and that's developing these new ways that are going to create differentiation from competitors that's relevant to customers. And so this is all of the work that we've got to be able to manage. We have to be able to see it using visual systems. We have to learn rapidly what's working and what isn't. And if we can manage that work more effectively by making choices and deploying it in lean learning loops, that's what I think gets us closer to a learning organization, that culture of experimentation. So with that, I'm done, Mike, and I'm going to turn over the questions to you.
Great. Well, I've unmuted the phones, so if anyone has any questions, they can chime in and speak up. We'll see if there's any questions that someone asked, where's the measurement? Don't know what the question is around measurement. How do we measure? I'm assuming measure improvement. There certainly has to be systems for measuring improvement. What's been your experience, Jeff?
Absolutely, so the visual management systems, the tracking centers at every level in the organization, so that we can see the cascade of work. Those measurement systems are critical. There would be, nothing in here that would say that those. I think it's gonna, maybe bring it a little bit more to life. What are we trying to really accomplish in what period of time? Mm-hmm. And I guess in my experience, we could have been better at the senior leadership level of discussing with people exactly what it is we expect to do by when. I think the quality of direction that we were giving people was relatively insufficient, and we were leaving it to other people to figure out what those metrics would be.
It's a good point. Appreciate that. Again, I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions for anyone on the phone call today. Either topics Jeff covered or the ones that I covered in my time earlier in the webinar. Jeff,
I'd like to maybe, if I could,
go ahead.
One example of how this becomes a different way of thinking in an organization.
That'd be great.
And so I've learned a lot from innovation and design thinking and lean startup kind of thinking, and the idea of the customer management process. And I think it's back in the book by Steve Blank on the customer management process called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And in there, he uses the example of Webvan. Webvan was one of those companies early into the space of us ordering our groceries online and having them delivered to our doorstep. They were very well capitalized, very bright people. I think brought in a CEO from Accenture. And they did cutting edge market research at the time to try to size and segment the market and figure out, where they were, who they were. And based on that research, they leased hundreds of thousands of square feet of warehouse space and bought a whole fleet of vans and opened up their doors, only to go bankrupt in 6 months because they had oversized the solution based on what people told them they might do in the market research. So when we bring in kind of the design thinking and lean startup into this, I would and try to get this type of thinking in the organization. Right before I retired from ThedaCare, I got a call from one of our rural administrators. And he said, I think that a reason that people aren't coming from this community south of me up to my hospital is because they have a transportation issue. So what would you think if I was to buy a van, trick it out, hire a driver, and do the marketing and run a transportation service? Well, in the old way, how we would have handled that is I would have said, well, let's do some market research. That's going to take 3 months. And then this is a $100,000 idea. So we're going to have to run it through the decision chain. And that's going to take a few months after we do the business plan. So in maybe 7 or 8 months, you'll maybe get your $100,000 and we can try this service. That would have been the old way. In the new way, all I had to say on that phone call was, I don't know, that could be a good idea. What is the most critical unknown assumption you're making behind that? Because I know you can buy a van and I know you can hire a driver. And so obviously would people use it? And so I just asked them, is there a cheap, fast way that you can test that assumption? And he said, yeah, actually down here, there is a transportation service that I can rent on a per use basis and just do the marketing and see if I'm meeting a need. And he did that, found that that wasn't a problem. It was not an unmet need. So for almost no money and no time, he was able to pivot away from that and go on to his next strategic idea.
That's great. It's a great example. I love it. I'm going to pause again and see if there's any questions from our participants today. Okay, I'm going to show some additional slides here. Before I do that, again, I want to thank Jeff for taking the time to present today and to provide some valuable insight. I'm looking forward to future conversation with you, Jeff. Found it very helpful.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone else.
So on this slide, we see some recommendations for further study, and my bet is, Jeff, you've got some things that you would recommend to be added to this list, and perhaps others on the call would find some resources and want to put those forth as far as recommendations for good resources to learn more about this. So if you learn by reading, you find some interesting things here. What I find interesting in this is you can find some interesting things on a military application about how this was applied through the centuries in the military. So you find some good readings there. Some suggestions for further study. We've done some webinars on this topic through a variety of participants. You can see them listed here. And again, you go to those bit.ly links, you'll find the recording and you can learn again from those recordings. And so those are all available. What's going to happen next, the recording for this webinar will be moved over to the right-hand side of our website. You can see there. And then anyone who logs in, they can go to the recording link and learn about the presentation, get the recording there. In September, friend and colleague Laura Brown from Memorial Care Health System in California is going to present on the important topic of leader standard work, and you can learn more about by going to that bit.ly link there at the bottom. In November, Friday the 17th, I mentioned side-by-side management, the most recent white paper. We're going to spend a bit of time unpacking that and talking about that to encourage people to learn a little bit more about that. In December, Dan Markovitz, who's a great resource, and I reached out to Dan because I get a lot of people asking questions about better personal management, how they can better make time for themselves, call it time management. And Dan is one of the resources that I always guide people to. And he's got an updated book that he's going to talk a little bit about some of the topics from that book. He calls it the fit organization. He compares it to the metaphor of being fit physically. And what do we need to do to apply the same concepts in our organization and our own management styles? So if you've got a story or lessons to share, we're putting things together for 2018. And just let me know. Use the email address there. Also, you can participate through LinkedIn on our IEX Pracademic Learning and Sharing Network group. So I hope everyone has a good day. And Jeff, again, thank you for the time that you took to give the presentation today. I really appreciate it. Thanks again, everyone, for participating. Have a good day.